If you're trying to figure out how to use AI without losing your edge, this one gets into it.
LLMs are wonderful at helping you find the median, but not necessarily wonderful at helping you find like extreme performance. And if you want to be somebody who's differentiated and great and gets hired time and time again for choices that you make, I assume that most people who are called to leadership aren't looking for a median, they're looking for.
He started in newsrooms, learning to separate stories from evidence. Now, he's building a tool that does the same thing for how managers lead. I'm Tom Horak, and this is Changing Shapes, a show where I sit down with people shaping culture through technology to get to the reason underneath. In this episode, I spoke with Ben Perreau. He's a former journalist, now the founder of Parafoil. It's a leadership intelligence tool that uses real meeting transcripts to help managers understand how they're actually leading, not how they think they are. Now, we got a lot into the distinction, how that exactly works and why it goes way beyond what you'd get from your standard AI tutor. Hello, and welcome to the Changing Shapes podcast. It's so great to have you here today, Ben. You've been right in the middle of how tools shape culture, which is what we talk about here. So who's Ben when it comes to that?
When it comes to shaping culture, it's funny, like I have such a changing relationship with culture. And so increasingly finding myself, in different contexts, different work, doing those things. But these days, Ben is building a leadership intelligence tool called Parafoil, living in Los Angeles, grappling with all the changes and sort of interesting headwinds and tailwinds of what's going on with AI and the advent of all this new tech, and just trying to find my way amongst it all, I guess.
Sounds great. I do want to get to Parafoil in the next question, but my first one, which is really I'm burning to ask you, is you started your career as a journalist and in radio before moving into leadership tech. How would you say does that storytelling background give you an advantage with LLMs? Because now we are using these tools to communicate with these AIs. Do you see a difference, and do you see a strength that comes there that we could learn from?
Yeah, starting my career in journalism at a particularly interesting time as well, in that when I started my career, we were sort of going through a lot of the newsroom revolution as we moved from an analog to a digital newsroom. And I was lucky enough to participate in that at a bunch of different places, ranging from the BBC to the New Musical Express to Sky Television. And as somebody who has a background in journalism, I suppose the thing that I was trained in was to separate stories from evidence. And I think leadership is the same. The transcript is the closest thing we have to shared reality. And I think increasingly, as I think about how that's playing out in terms of AI, discernment is becoming a more and more important skill. And so learning how to use our judgment, learning to become more discerning. But I do worry because, AI is generating very persuasive narratives for a lot of people in the world. And so as we build products, as we think about how we engage with AI, I think we have to keep thinking about what was said by whom, in what moment, and really using our discernment to separate, stories from evidence consistently.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's a skill that would be so good to also teach in schools, and I think it'll become more and more important as sort of our kids start to grow up and how to engage with the surrounding media that's around us. So yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say, like, critical reasoning is increasingly hard, and in the Web 1 era, we sort of we're starting to receive a gigantic volume of content that we weren't necessarily expecting. In the Web 2 era, that became social media. And so through social media, we were just starting to receive a lot more information, some of which was not necessarily fact-based. I think the AI era is going to challenge us, even more again. And so I'm sort of curious to see how we as a, are going to adapt to this.
Me too. And what trends that'll bring with it, because I can definitely sense that there's a lot of shifts happening there. So double tapping on Parafoil, how does that work? Tell us what it is and how does it work on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. So, Parafoil, we call it leadership intelligence. It helps managers get better at leading by turning real meetings that they're having into insight and tracking progress over time. So historically, a lot of the way that you developed as a leader has been through heuristics, training courses, coaching sessions, conversations with chatbots, honestly, in a lot of cases. I think that the differentiating factor for us is that we're using real conversations and analyzing those to understand how you led. And so for individuals, they don't have to use heuristics anymore. They can use the reality of their leadership output to try and get a better understanding of how they're doing. And so it just closes the gap between understanding and then being able to change your behavior. And, great leadership is all about behavior change. At the organizational level, Parafoil provides anonymized, always-on visibility into leadership patterns. But we don't make any privacy trade-offs. So none of the individualized data is available at the organizational level. There are no surveys which bias the data. So it's gathered in a way that helps you get more evidence-based data. And so it gives the organization tools to understand how their leadership population is doing en masse. And it gives individuals a way to improve much more rapidly and generate, more performance as a leader with their teams. And so the goal is to just kind of try and up-level the entirety of the leadership in an organization much faster than you were able to historically.
Right. And that is based on transcripts from various meetings mostly, or other types of conversations?
Yeah, we use meeting output at the moment. So that means transcripts, audio, sometimes video, to understand what's going on in the conversation. And then we look at various different conversational markers, semantic markers, psycholinguistic markers, cognitive markers to understand what's going on. And then later, I imagine we will look at other ways to kind of help you sort of gather more from the different surface areas of your leadership. Slack and email and all those other places are places where your leadership exists. In-person conversations probably would be next. So we're sort of building into those areas, but right now we're mostly focused on the conversations that you have and how we can gather data from those conversations.
That's great. And I'm curious to hear when you do have a Slack integration, because one thing I've noticed a lot is that we, sometimes there's a, 50 item thread in Slack, which could have been a 2-minute phone call, and the communication style in asynchronous typed situations can be very different, and the assessment of how well that is going can be very different to the spoken words. That's definitely an interesting upgrade. And then marrying how you to the one person who is also two people, one how they communicate in Slack and one in reality, which I think is really interesting. I could see how the sort of framing AI as a bionic enhancement to help managers see and refine their own patterns makes a lot of sense. But I wonder on a sort of human level, how do you get buy-in? Because it could, if there are situations where I could see that somebody might be dismissing feedback from colleagues or maybe not hearing it, what stops them from saying the AI is hallucinating about me? Or is it maybe that the AI is maybe more objective and they're like, oh, well, it's not just the people saying it, it's also the machine.
Yeah. I mean, I think feedback as a practice is something it took me a while to learn. And so I don't assume that everybody is in that gear of gathering feedback from different corners of the organization or from other tools. We built Parafoil as a performance tool for people who are dedicated to it. So if you think of going running, lots of people run, jog, choose to exercise in that way, outdoors, indoors, on the treadmill. But, those who are very committed to their performance use tracking tools to understand what is the pace of my run? How am I doing? How am I managing my heart rate? They're really dedicated to doing things like VO2 max, all that kind of stuff. So all of these performance indicators and markers help them understand like how they're doing and give them feedback for what's going on. We built Parafoil for them, a group of people who are most dedicated to their performance. And so we know that from studying people in that context, that they're already using chatbots, ChatGPT, Claude, and other tools to go and try and develop better spidey sense, for want of a better word, for how they're leading. And so what we, the origin of Parafoil was really, can we create better outcomes for managers who are most dedicated to their performance? Because I, for one, am somebody who, I don't know if you ever do this, Thomas, I'll send an email, maybe it's a high stakes email, I don't know. We're sort of working with a new customer or something. And I'll send the email and once I've sent it out, I'll look back at the email and be like, did I send a good email? Which is a ridiculous notion. An email went 5 minutes ago, but I'll still sit there and reread my email in a kind of sort of borderline narcissistic way. I'm sort of sitting there going, was this a good email? Did I do a good job? Oh my goodness, like that sentence, I'm not sure. And actually, that's why I have the undo button on my Gmail set to the maximum, because I have that paranoia.
Same.
10 seconds probably or something, not much. But, Parafoil is a tool for people who also have those kinds of anxieties that I have. And so we're hoping to find ways to be able to calm them by saying, hey, listen, here's a non-judgmental machine that's got all of the world's leadership knowledge, behavioral science, cognitive science baked into it. I will say any resistance we've encountered, usually most people, it's a fear of exposure and a loss of control, right? I think most people are concerned. It's identity loss that I think most people worry about. So I think buy-in starts with boundaries. Parafoil is private by default. Only you can see the output of Parafoil. Only the individual manager. Transparent evidence. Manager chooses their own goal in terms of what they're working on. We don't have any kind of oversight. There's no surveillance going on. As I think I mentioned at the top of the conversation, the HR team just sees extrapolated empirical data about the population en masse. And so there's nothing really that invades any individual's privacy there. And so we try and help people have small, fast, undeniable wins so that they don't feel like they're being surveilled and having to give too much up to gain quite a lot is the idea for us.
Yeah, I can see that. And I can see, so that it's not necessarily that the organization would make you use it. It is something where the manager themselves, they find it and they see this as their way to just get an edge. And that probably will be inspiring to others who maybe might want to learn in a similar way, rather than it being sort of foisted upon someone. It's like, well, your management is terrible, you should use this, which could be more friction. There could be more friction there.
Yeah, there are tools out there that do that. The sort of the HR team will say, ChatGPT is not a safe thing for you to use. Here's our version of BPT, and their version is sort of, shot in the leg, doesn't work properly. It's sort of not such a good chatbot, and everyone has to use it. Those products, I think, exist. I just think most managers choose the best solution for themselves, and so it tends to be a difficult path.
I heard you talk about AI as a mirror for intent versus impact, but in a way, I also find that since it costs neither money nor shame to check that reflection privately when I use these tools, whereas if I do that with a human, then I'll have, there'll be more baggage around it. How does one prevent it from becoming the GPS for emotional intelligence? So by that, I mean that it'll lead us for these skills to atrophy rather than building on top of those skills. And that's not so much just a question about how do you solve that in the product of Parafoil, but like how should people be using these tools to make sure that it's actually enhancing rather than atrophying skills?
Yeah. It is it's such an interesting question, Thomas, for our time. It's something that I think about a lot too, and I don't pretend to have the answer to the question, I suppose. But when I think about the problem, I worry that people who want to demonstrate leadership might outsource really critical leadership skills like judgment to a tool, and it becomes, to a point, a crutch. And then their output sort of looks smoother and everything looks cleaner, but actually what they're not really developing their own leadership skills or developing an understanding of what's going on with their team. My belief is that once you become too reliant on cut paste chatbot output, you start to get into a place where you're allowing your sort of judgment to let the AI tool lead. That's when you start to drift off. And I feel like there's a loss of identity in that you also lose your own authenticity in your own leadership, which is where the value is. Right? Most people are hired. People talk about managers versus leaders. Managers can be effective. Leaders are sort of called to lead people. For the most part, I think it's important for any leader who's stepping into a new role to want to go and find the most authentic version of themselves, so they can choose how they're going to go and lead in the future. Because that's why you get hired time and time again. It's because you are you, and the way that you've chosen to lead in the past has caused you to make these decisions and that judgment and so on. If you lose track of that and you delegate that, you lose your competitive edge. In fact, most chatbots, these sort of LLMs, are wonderful at helping you find the median, but not necessarily wonderful at helping you find like extreme performance. And if you want to be somebody who's differentiated and great and gets hired time and time again for choices that you make, I assume that most people who are called to leadership aren't looking for the median. They're looking for more than that. And so, we built Parafoil to ensure that there's a human in the loop. It's an irony that we called the company Applied Humanity Inc. because it's meant to be a joke. The very idea that humans get completely disintermediated by AI is quite frankly preposterous as far as I'm concerned, because what will happen is we will find ourselves in a world where humans will be required to be in different loops from the ones they were in before. That's just the way that it's always gone with technology and automation. And so there will be a adjustment period. But I think, ultimately where we'll end up is a recognition of the fact that inserting your own humanity into your leadership is table stakes for choosing to be a leader. And so I'm curious what you think, Thomas. But for me, I think the idea of allowing it to become a crutch for you as a leader means you're sort of delegating your responsibility and your choice to lead, which feels like something I would feel sad about for myself.
What I try to do is if I'm writing something or if I'm doing research on something or if I'm, even in an interaction that might be a bit complicated, I sometimes work with a actual human and say, you know what, here's this communication. What do you think about that? And get real feedback. I can't send every email to my colleague. So it is sometimes tempting to run these things through some kind of a tool that gives me feedback. But what's really important for me is to kind of give it instructions that it should just give me feedback like an editor of what it sees that I've written, and to tell me, well, here are some of the points that, that could be a little bit too sharp, or here, this isn't quite clear what you're saying at this point. Don't do it for me. Let me do it, but give me that reflection. Does that resonate with how Parafoil works?
It resonates with me a lot, not least because, you're choosing not to delegate your own judgment, right? And you're instructing, and let's just for a second make sure we're separating AI umbrella, chatbots, presentation layer from the LLM, which is a sort of underlying technology that drives a lot of chatbots. At Parafoil, we haven't built a chatbot. It's important to us that's not how it works. But a lot of people are using chatbots to paste, copy in, and receive stuff back. I've done it before, especially useful with code. With those tools, when you're using them, you do have to instruct them to be clear. You do have to say to them, listen, I want edits in this way and not this way. And there's a reason for that, because most of those big sort of LLM builders who have built these chatbots that sit on the front of them, they have KPIs just like everybody else, and engagement and time used, daily active users are so core to their set of metrics. And so they thrive on giving you answers that keep you coming back and engage in the conversation and aren't just a sort of one shot, we're done. And, they respond to everything you say. Whereas sometimes you send an email, you don't expect a response, And I think, it reminds me of a sort of my career in journalism. There used to be a time when, I don't know whether it's still the same way because I haven't worked in the newsroom now for about 10 years, but when editors of a section or a magazine or a newspaper or even a television segment would go out and then they'd come back for holiday or vacation for 2 weeks, a week. In the summer, they'd come back and then they would make some changes just because they came back, and their job was to make sure that they were showing everyone their value as a discerning tastemaker, as somebody who comes in and says, well, you've been without my judgment for 2 weeks. So now that I'm back, we're going to make some changes. And so it would be, people would come back on the day before the cover was meant to be submitted and just change the cover. Let's just change the cover. And it would be arbitrary, actually, because the cover was probably perfectly good. And I think, in that same way, chatbots and LLMs are driven to make the change, to demonstrate their value in a way that sometimes goes beyond their necessary utility. And so increasingly, I find myself thinking, if I paste it in here and I ask for your input, even if I give you guide rails, you have to give me something. And so I think there's a cautionary tale there for me in terms of how I think about how I engage with a chatbot because of the way that its KPIs, its incentive structure has been put together.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think leading to the training from that, there is that average trap from these general purpose models that you talked about. But I think the other question there is then, once we start moving away from the general purpose ones, we talk about who gets to define what the better version of a leader is in that model, and sort of what are we optimizing towards, and also how do we make sure that the today's blind spots don't turn into tomorrow's training data. And that's quite a lot of responsibility to make sure that that's balanced. And is that something that you want to have that authenticity so that everybody can be their authentic better self, but also there are some general guiding principles that we need to work towards. How do you find that balance?
Yeah. When you go and sit in a training course, there's 30 of you in a classroom, or 15 sometimes, and you're sort of watching the instructor, the trainer, and they sort of have these sort of do's and don'ts and best practices and that kind of stuff. But you still have to come away from that and say, hey, listen, are those things that I want to apply? Do they feel right for the context that I'm in? One of the great things about being able to use one-to-one technology is we can much more highly personalize the output, for better and for worse, to the earlier conversation. I think if we were to just say, here's what good leadership looks like, follow this, then obviously we'd be using decades of stereotypes that I think could be quite problematic. Better cannot be a single leadership archetype, right? Leadership is contextual, it's cultural. You're in Europe and I'm in the United States at this point. Our business cultures are different. Role is different for different people. Team maturity, the moment you're in. Are you on a pressing deadline or is this a business as usual moment? All of these things change the situation, and people are situational. But also, to your point, we are more than just kind of meat sacks regurgitating the stuff that we've learned. We really have to be able to use our judgment on a discernment individually through our own lived experiences. And so the manager is the person who defines the intention, and the team's experience defines whether it's working. And the tool's job is to surface evidence of behavior and impact. So we built Parafoil to be a tool that helps you find the best way for you to lead. And that starts with a choice at the beginning. When you first load Parafoil up, there are 8 leadership archetypes that you choose from at the beginning of your journey. And those change and evolve over the course of time. And they also become more situational as you spend more time using Parafoil. And so in choosing one of those archetypes, it helps you say, listen, I want to be a really democratic leader to start with, or because everyone has a home base. I want to be a really directional leader. I want to be much more of a, people use this word servant leader. So everyone is looking to find their own home base, I think, in terms of the way that they most naturally lead. And when you first step into leadership, that's a subconscious or a conscious choice that I think most people make. Mm-hmm. And so we're trying to build something that allows you to have configurable goals. You can put your short-term performance goals into Parafoil, and it will help you work towards them. But we know that there are trade-offs with all of that stuff, and that people want to move in. People want to move in a direction where they're becoming more effective. And sometimes people see what the archetype of that is inside a organization. Our belief is if you don't want to conform to whatever the organization's perspective of what performance looks like, and you want to find your own version of that, and you eventually discover through the use of Parafoil or other tools that you're not the right fit for the organization, that's okay too. We're all on our own journey. And so I think, we're building something that hopefully is much more geared towards finding your own path rather than something that I think is driving us all towards this center, which was built out of a lot of AI. LLMs are trained on decades of literature. So that means what leadership was like in the 1960s and the 1970s and the 90s. I mean, God forbid, those moments now are thankfully in the past. So let's try and keep them there.
Those cases, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting hearing you talk about that, because we, in the previous episode, in the interview that, as we're recording, isn't out yet, but by the time people hear this, it will have been the previous episode, we were talking about education and how the education space is changing with LLMs. But the way you're describing how Parafoil works, to me, seems like a way how the version of education is coming to life, that it's not necessarily it's sort of external experience. It's something where you learn something, if you know or don't know about these 8 archetypes, you learn about those, you make decisions and you move within them. And then you get kind of constant feedback on your interactions. And so you have this sort of interactive guide that's teaching you as you go along the way. And I can really see how that, for me, education isn't just university or school. I think, we're learning something all the time. At least I think that's the fun thing about life, that we always get to learn. And I can really see how this version of reflection on a goal that you have can really be a sort of nice merging of how a tool like this will work and enhance the human experience, because it is giving you some live feedback.
Yeah, to your point, growth has to be about so much more than instruction, doesn't it? It has to be about so much more than sort of here's the right way, read the textbook, go away and ingest it. And actually, this is at the heart of how we think about leadership too. I believe it's really hard to teach leadership, and that most people learn to lead through praxis. And I was, when I first started managing people, I was definitely a horrific leader and had to kind of go through the motions of trying to understand how to get better. And I think it's only through that constant commitment to a habit and a set of behaviors and sort of a choice to put yourself in the way of spaces where you might grow more and get better, that you become better at leadership. You can read all the leadership books you want, and they are helpful, but without an opportunity to put them into practice, I think it's really hard to improve. And so you have to be intentional about that stuff. And it comes from those small daily moments. To your point, school, and university and all these places, we're learning, but we're putting these things into practice in the world. And that's why I think liberal arts degrees are so important still, because we all are sort of trying to understand and learn more about each other and how we express ourselves and what's going on in the world and how to interpret that and how to channel that. And so there is room for both of these things. And I think bringing together the sort of the functional and the mechanical and the rational along with the emotional is how we build the sort of better whole than we maybe have done historically.
I love that. I love that. On the note of learning and these tools, what do you think today's leadership tools still get wrong at a product level? And also, do you think there are any trends that we'll look back on that we have that exist today that we'll look back on as a bit naive in a couple of years?
I'd be curious what your product brain, how you feel about this from a product perspective, but I'm a little bearish on sort of the ubiquity of chat interfaces at the moment. And to me, that's like trying to drink your whole meal through a straw. It's like you're looking at this stream of information coming at you. And we have these full two-dimensional surfaces that we've created for expression. And increasingly other methods too, voice. And yet we've chosen to sort of fire words at you one at a time. Like that's okay for some contexts. But my personal opinion is that the time for that will come and pass. And there will be places where those things stick. We've got moments where they're starting to hold. But I think we really over-rotated on that interface because we got so excited about how uncanny it was to be able to have a small c conversation with those chatbots. And I think, ChatGPT has been an inspirational product that has changed the way we think about products and changed the way we think about human-computer interaction fundamentally. And I think we're starting to evolve beyond that now. And so my opinion is, that will be seen as a sort of this sort of text-based type generational set of tools will get very dated to this moment. That's my personal opinion, but I am curious to know what you think because you're a product expert and you know about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we actually did an episode with Hiba about this one, that how it is very much of its time and it does something good, but it kind of was an accident, right? So you probably know that ChatGPT wasn't supposed to be a chatbot. It was just a way how to interact with the LLM. And they were like, well, let's release it, see how people react. And then it all of a sudden took off because it has this magical feeling, but it was never intended even to be the main way how to interact with these tools. And I always go back to thinking about it that I remember as a kid watching with my grandparents, The Next Generation, and how Star Trek, The Next Generation, and how they would interact with the computer just by speaking. And I always found that, like, okay, this works in the sort of theatrical setup of Star Trek, but to me, it always felt like that seems like the worst way to interact for certain things, like, yes, make my Earl Grey. Sure, that's pretty quick to do that in a voice command, but flying a spaceship, like, all their UI seemed really arbitrary, and doing that with voice command doesn't seem like exactly the right way. And I feel that we're in a similar position now where, yes, it's magical. Yes, it's novel. And yes, we are creatures that communicate through words, but it's just scratching the surface. There needs to be more depth to it. And I'm finding the trend that you can just build yourself, you can vibe code yourself your own app for your own niche requirement, whatever it is that you need, and you don't have to wait for some developer to make it. I can see that as the next evolution of it, that I just need this tool that reminds me about something, or that notifies me about something, or where I can organize my information or my approach to something. I can just get that tool built for myself. It's not public, it's just for me. I think that's the direction that we're going with these tools, that we can communicate what it is that I'm trying to do, but the actual output is a bit of software that lives either in a browser or on my phone or somewhere else, and we'll be interacting with it in a much deeper and more useful kind of way where text doesn't necessarily suffice.
That sounds right, doesn't it? Software will be on the fly, and maybe more under the code will be more under the bonnet, and we'll be able to, we call it vibe coding now, and some people use that word disparagingly. I think actually we'll be able to, just to your point, build a lot of software on the fly for our needs. Over the weekend, I built a data labeling tool to help us do some other data labeling. We have great software engineers on Parafoil, and they don't let me loose on the code base anymore, which is great for everyone. But some of the tools around the edge that we use internally only, which don't have any sort of impact on the core tool, I do sometimes experiment and prototype, and it's useful because I now have more fluency again in being able to build things and bring them to life. And I think increasingly that will be every one of us who can say, can you use the two APIs from my car to connect to my lights and make sure the lights are on when I come home? All the kind of stuff that you just want to be able to just do, and you can just think it into reality in some way. I think that is a future that I hope for.
So closing out, two final questions. One, I can really see how using types of AI tools like Parafoil is a tide that lifts all boats. But also, if AI becomes part of every leader's daily workflow, what habit do you think will separate those who succeed from those who fail?
Yeah, I think the future will contain different amounts of AI for different people. And I think to the conversation we've had today, I think the best summation I can mount of it is recognize that your own humanity is in the loop for a reason. Otherwise, you would be automated out of the picture. And so I think the best leaders are going to really work on taste, discernment, judgment, all of these things which move you out of the median and give you an unusual shape as a leader. And the more unusual your shape, I think, the more differentiated you are in the marketplace, the more valuable you are to your employer, the more I think you will do and encounter work that is interesting to you and uniquely you. And so my advice and hope for everyone who is thinking about leadership in the sort of post-AI era is to continue to develop those parts of themselves and to accept that the functional efficiency, day-to-day routing of tasks, if that's your area of focus, it's maybe time to start thinking differently about how you approach your job.
I think that really also resonates culturally to how people perceive things so quickly if people get a feeling of what's AI generated, whether it's image or text or anything else. And I think having that maybe slightly, even if it's a bit more coarse or just different, this is actually a real human I'm speaking to, we'll become very sensitive to recognizing those patterns. And I think that's, we've only been using these tools for a relatively short amount of time, but you can already sense that people notice that very quickly. So I think that really resonates with that sort of the way that culture is going in that way. As a final question, is there one thing that you believe about leadership in the age of AI that maybe most people or some people in your industry would disagree with?
Yeah, I mean, we started to touch on it, but we never really went there. A lot of companies there's been a lot of job cuts in technology in particular, partly because the sort of zero interest rate era of 2020, 2021 meant mass hiring in a lot of big tech companies. And a lot of people are very concerned about disintermediation of their roles, job automation, all that kind of stuff. I think that stuff will happen, but only in the areas where those jobs are easily automatable. I think the contrarian thinking that I have is that for those of us who are able, there's also a tremendous amount of opportunity. And so for every company that's 3 people that used to be 30 people, there will also be 10 more companies. And so this is the time for, if you've got something you want to build, if there's something you feel called to go and make, it's never been easier to prototype it, to envision its reality, to go and start to create some version of it, even if it's the smallest kernel of what it is you want to go and build. And so I would encourage everyone to recognize that there's going to be a gigantic amount of job growth. A lot of new roles are going to exist that didn't exist before. And if you get ahead of it and you don't worry about we've talked about not resting on your laurels and not being somebody who just routes tasks through a system. I think if you feel like you're somebody who's called to go and do something because you're excited about something, it's a really good time to be able to do the weekend hack, experiment a little bit, do the thing that you're feeling enthused about. And the cost of doing that is so much lower than it used to be. And for years, we've been taught, the engineering cost of that is going to take you weeks to build. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. Now you can do that. And so I think the contrarian belief that I have is it's a really great time to be making things. And so I would encourage everyone to try and make things, even if that's not something they've historically done.
I love that optimistic view. And I agree. I think it really, it's such a democratizing time where it's so those barriers for entry are just gone. I think it's really wonderful because it just means that we can really make things more quickly, and we can, I've got friends who work in large corporations and they have an idea that will impact the business, and they can prototype it and build it and bring it to senior leadership and say, you know what, I've been trying to communicate this here, just test it and you can then understand my idea. And it's such an invigorating time for experimentation, which, yeah, like you say, it offers so many opportunities. It is wild, and you got to be there for the ride. But yeah, I like the optimistic take. That's really great.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think it is important to be optimistic when you're in the game of building things.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you so much, Ben. This was a really great conversation. So yeah,
Thanks
thanks
for having me,
for
Thomas.
joining us, taking the time, and giving us some insight and the added optimism. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure was mine. Thanks.
Thank you.